I call this presentation Compassion in Action just because, well, I like the way it sounds, but I also feel like the action behind reducing access barriers for survivors is a huge component for us as community members, as librarians, as library workers. So I'm here today to talk about the Creating Access for Violence Survivors program, which I created and implemented at the Monroe County Public Library in Bloomington, Indiana. So this is me. I'm currently working as an outreach librarian at Turner Free Library, which is in Randolph, Massachusetts, which is on the South Shore. So it's like 25 minutes south of downtown Boston. We are a member of the Old Colony Library Network Consortium. Our town is about 30,000 people. We're very international. We have people from around the world. We have a large Haitian American and Vietnamese American populations there. So it's very diverse. And while I'm not going to be talking about our library specifically today, it has informed how I do this presentation because it really has changed the way I look at what I'm talking about and how other libraries can implement similar projects or program ideas, in that we're not all the same. So I am originally from California, the Bay Area. I worked in the book industry for many years as a used book buyer, and I worked as a paraprofessional for about 3.5 years at Monroe County Public Library while I went back to school to get my master's in library science from Indiana University, Bloomington. And about a little over a year ago, I graduated last May and I was hired as an outreach librarian, and I moved to Quincy, Massachusetts, which is also on the South Shore. So I like to keep this slide on for people because we are going to be talking about trauma, and regardless of our lives outside of the room, you know, people experience trauma differently, and I understand completely that this can be a difficult subject to talk about. It can be triggering, and I want everyone to feel comfortable with, you know, you can turn your camera off if you need to, you can step away. This is not, you know, I don't need you to be like showing your face if you don't want to. And so I also like to have it because it's a difficult subject for me to talk about. So I'm just gonna like take a deep breath. And then we can start getting into it. So domestic violence is, I feel like we talk about it more these days than in the past, and we have different understanding of it than, I think typically there was a very rigid definition of who could experience domestic violence and what domestic violence is. So like at just the very, in the simplest terms, it's a partner seeking power and control over the other partner. So it does not necessarily have to include physical or sexual abuse. And I think financial abuse is often tied to domestic violence, and it impacts our patrons who are survivors in a huge way when they are trying to access services. So, you know, many of you may already be familiar with this definition and these ideas, but I just like to cover it once before we start talking about survivors and how they are able to use the library or not use it. So like I said, I was in Bloomington. Monroe County Public Library actually encompasses a few smaller towns in Monroe County that are very rural. So Bloomington, I think probably some of you are already familiar with Bloomington. It's a college town. When the school year is not in session, I think there's like 40,000 people there. And when the school year is in session, it jumps up to 80,000 people. And it can be very international as well, because people come from around the world to do research, to attend the school, to become faculty there. You know, my experience as a paraprofessional there led me to interact with patrons on the front lines. And I had an interaction with a patron that, you know, they were a survivor and they had a card and they had access, but I was doing an address check just to verify. We always would do that one time a year. And the person tensed up, and I could see in their account that it had taken them a really long time, like weeks and weeks, to get a card, because they were a survivor of domestic violence and they were in hiding. And they were using the address confidentiality program as sort of like if you aren't aware of how it works, states that have it, it's through their state attorney general's office. It creates a ghost address for them. And it's wonderful because they forward mail, and then your physical address doesn't have to be known. But the downside of it is that your address is a PO box and it's in the state capital. So a person using address confidentiality program shouldn't have to say like, no, I live in this county or I live in this municipality. But because there's oftentimes not a lot of marketing about the program, some people will be like, you don't live here, or you can't, you know, open a bank account or whatever because this isn't a real address, or doesn't show that you live here. And so when I let the patron know that I was familiar with the address confidentiality program and they didn't have anything to worry about, it changed our entire interaction. Everything sort of just like relaxed. And it got me thinking about, you know, my own experience, which is I am a domestic violence survivor myself, and I was enrolled in the Oregon address confidentiality program for 4 years. And so I was thinking, like, what if that had been me? And I went to the library to try to get my library card, and I had my address confidentiality program card, and the first person I interacted with said, you don't live in this county, or this isn't enough to prove that you live here. And if it had been me at that time in my life, I would have left and I never would have come back. And so I wasn't sure at the time sort of what I was going to do with that, but I had an inkling that it meant that there was an issue and that maybe I should look into this more. So I wanted to do a little bit of research on Mississippi, and I've done this for Indiana and Massachusetts, where I have done a similar presentation before. So just to show the statistics, this is just my personal belief. I believe the numbers are probably higher than what is reported. But as you can see, almost 40% of women and almost 32% of men in Mississippi have experienced some type of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And this is just like a snapshot of a single day from 2019. So 354 survivors were served by a domestic violence program in Mississippi. And 57 requests for services went unmet. So that means that 57 people went to or 57 requests. I guess it doesn't have to be 57 people, but 57 requests were not fulfilled because, you know, I'm sure we're all aware resources are tight in any nonprofit. This is from the Mississippi fact sheet, which I did send along. So I encourage you to check that out. I generally do include a statistic about the percentage of homicides that are related to intimate partner violence. Mississippi doesn't track that data, but there are national statistics, and that number is very high for people who identify as women. I also like to point out that not everyone, you know, this is a sort of like a snapshot of the entire population, but it's not like every single person who is a survivor or every single population experiences violence in the same way. So some of us, some identities are going to be experiencing more violence, some less, and I think it's important to never, you know, pigeonhole anyone who is a survivor, or make assumptions about their experience, just based on how they present or their identity. So this is just a bar graph of the circulation numbers we have had over about a 2-year period. So this is Old Colony Library Networks. We have 29 libraries in the consortium. And you can see family violence is the highest number of checkouts tied to these sort of subject headings. This I just requested from the consortium and they provided them to me. So if you attended last week's session, you already are familiar with Miranda. I like to think that everyone wants to help and wants to fight this fight, but I also know that not everybody thinks about it in the terms of like, why is a library important to a survivor's recovery from violence? And I love this quote from Miranda because she talks about like the very real, tangible ways that we can provide support and not, I know we're all being asked to do more with less, and I don't think that people who work in libraries should be taking on more, but that we can, with what we're already doing and what we're already meant to do, we can create change. So I already shared a little bit about my story, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the transformative power of libraries. I'm sure we're all like, yes, we believe in our mission. Libraries are great. But my personal experience, I think is the library was very powerful for me as an individual. So this is a picture of the central branch of Multnomah County Public Library, which is, this branch is in Portland, Oregon. So my story is that I left an abuser in early 2012, and I didn't really know anything about domestic violence or abuse, and I didn't really understand that it wasn't possible for me to just leave. So, I ended up in October 2012, I went into hiding and I moved from California to Oregon. And I was quasi-homeless for about 15 months total. I was, as I mentioned, enrolled in the address confidentiality program for 4 years. And I lived out of 2 suitcases pretty much. So I was at a pretty like devastatingly critical time in my life where I had nothing. And I had varied experiences with crisis centers. The one in California that was local to my community, I was turned away from several times. The one in Portland was actually a huge help. But there were some things like housing is a huge issue for everyone, I think, or for most of us. But I was unable to get help with housing because there just weren't resources or housing available. So at this time of in my life, I went to the public library. I got a library card when I moved, and this was the first place that I felt safe to be. It was the first place that I felt like I was allowed to be without having to like purchase something or have a reason for being there. You know, for fundraising purposes, I also like to talk about I use the internet and the computers to like apply for jobs. I went to their job workshops, and like they had a job center on site. But I also had access to leisure materials, and I was able to check out books that I would never have been able to purchase. I was able to check out music and movies. This was like I think there were digital materials happening at this time, but like I wasn't really plugged into that. So I was checking out DVDs and CDs. But I believe that leisure is also a human right, and that, you know, libraries provide leisure materials in addition to being educational. And, you know, my experience as a survivor I remember feeling like I always had to be bettering myself, or like proving that I was bettering myself. And, you know, on this trajectory to like becoming a model citizen again, I felt like I had failed and all of these things. But like, it was very important for my recovery to also be able to relax and to read for pleasure and to experience things that I enjoyed again. And so I like to point this out because oftentimes when I've done research into domestic violence survivors and libraries, the focus is almost always on connecting survivors to social services, which is incredibly important. And I would never try to downplay that importance, but also like we don't tell people what to use the library for. Like we would never demand anyone show they're like only using the library to you know, quote unquote better themselves. So you know, when we're talking about reducing access barriers for people, I want to point out that that includes leisure, that includes downtime, and making sure people can rest. So, okay. What are these access barriers? What is preventing people from accessing library services? You know, when we're talking about this, I like to talk about things in terms of equity rather than equality. You know, sometimes when I'm having a conversation with someone, it's like, well, we should always treat everybody the same exact way. So like if you lost a library book, like, you know, that's it. And your account's in bad standing now or whatever. So, But there are different types of barriers that I've encountered in my time working in libraries. So this big one, and the one that I actually thought would be the sort of like largest barrier, the one we would encounter the most, is proof of address. So I know in Massachusetts, there is a state requirement for this proof of address and current ID. So that makes it very difficult for individual libraries to kind of get around if we're working with someone who is homeless or living in a shelter, or they don't have, they lost their documents because they were fleeing violence. People might not know what the address confidentiality program is if that comes up. So survivors might get turned away sort of like at the door when they are trying to get a library card just because they don't have the documentation that we required. Safety is also an issue, especially if this is somebody who has recently left their abuser. That's the most dangerous time for them. They are at the most risk for being murdered at that time. So if we have to provide, if we require people to provide their actual physical address, that could be potentially putting their safety in danger. I know for me, like, I almost didn't vote in the 2020 election because I was so scared about providing my address. And this was before I was enrolled in the ACP. But there was a nonprofit that was like registering people in Pioneer Square. And luckily for me, one of the people there was like, "Oh, are you scared about having your address be public?" And I was like, "Yes." And he said, "You can pick up your ballot from, the election headquarters or wherever, the voting location." And so that's literally the only reason I voted in 2012, was because one person recognized what was happening and he had a solution for me to get around my address being made public. Lack of trust, I think this is also a big one. Oftentimes the institutions or organizations that are set up to help survivors do not do that. And survivors can be failed by multiple institutions, including the library, before we ever interact with them. And I know, like, again, this is just my personal experience and I'm speaking as an individual, but my personal experience with the justice system especially, I was largely failed by many institutions. And, I personally didn't have like an issue with the library because I didn't have any problems getting a card or feeling welcome there, but this is anecdotal. This is my personal experience. And I can easily see how someone might not feel safe, especially if they had an interaction with someone who worked at the library that didn't go well, or made them feel like, they should be ashamed, or they, that's just, they walked away from the interaction feeling ashamed or feeling that they did something wrong.
Shannon, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is Lacey. Prior to, fleeing your situation, had you been a library user prior to that, like a regular library user?
I was I lived in a rural location, so I was a bookmobile user.
Okay. I'm just thinking about those, DV survivors that maybe weren't public library users, and now coming to the public library is a new thing. And, you had somewhat of a positive experience with the public library prior to that. And those that maybe have never had a public library experience, it could be even a greater barrier to access.
That's 100% true. And when I was working on CAVS, I actually realized that my own experience had really colored the way that I was looking at, the situation on a larger scale, more populations, that like not everybody had the same experience as me. And this is actually a great segue to my next slide, which is about, well, it's somewhat related, but I really was like, oh, the issue that I'm gonna hear the most about is the address confidentiality program, or like having to prove your location, that you live in the county or the municipality. And when I reached out to the local crisis center, they were like, I just asked in a broad way, like, what are you hearing from your clients? Are you hearing anything? Is anybody trying to use the library? Do they want to use the library and they can't? What's the issue? And they were like, by far the thing we hear the most is that we have people who are already account holders, but they can't use the library anymore because they had to abandon materials while fleeing their abuser, because they're also experiencing financial abuse. They do not have the money to pay off the fines and fees. And so they just don't come anymore because there were people who felt ashamed. There were people who felt embarrassed. There were people who felt like, you know, it was their fault. And like, the thing is, nobody should have to choose between their physical safety or their emotional safety and like library materials. Just, that's not I mean, obviously people will choose their safety, but like, we shouldn't punish people who have to make that choice and choose to leave, or choose to, you know, their abuser might destroy the materials on purpose. So I will say also, yeah, that I think sort of like in a broader way, a broader sense, showing the library is supportive of survivors and like a welcoming place for survivors is kind of a little bit different, but it is something I do talk about in the handout that I provided. And I think Miranda also covers this as well. And then the last thing on here is that, you know, a survivor might encounter that their abuser in the library. It's a public space. So, you know, do you have a policy or a procedure for handling that? I think many libraries do have procedure or policy around when you have patrons and one of them has a restraining order against the other one. So if you do, I would say maybe look to that for precedents, but also, you know, someone might be a survivor and not have a restraining order against their abuser. But yeah, that's kind of getting into the weeds. So I also like to talk about library staff barriers because, you know, this is a hard thing, you know, like I said in the beginning, it's a hard thing to talk about. And it is complicated. And, you know, I feel conflicted about like asking staff to be all things to all people, and putting more and more on people who have in many cases worked through a pandemic, who are already burned out and already experienced compassion fatigue. That being said, I do think it makes sense to provide resources for staff. So some of the issues that can come up is they may not understand that survivors have changing needs. There's a great article or journal article that I share in that document about informational needs for survivors changing. And I mean, that is maybe more in depth than we need to look at, but like survivors, every person who comes in the door who is a survivor is not going to have the same needs, and the same person isn't going to have the same needs, information needs. So You know, we also have people with diverse identities. You know, we're all individual people and we come from different backgrounds, and you know, the library is a public space for information. So like I said, it's going to be complicated. They might not know how to interact with survivors, and they may not be trained on how to recognize signs of domestic violence and trauma. You know, oftentimes survivors will have multiple diagnoses. They might be struggling with you know, substance use disorder. They might have mental health issues. Trauma on its own can change the brain. So we might be seeing like behavioral issues in the library that are tied to domestic violence. So just talking a little bit about creating access for violence survivors. Essentially how it started was I had this interaction with the patron that I mentioned earlier. I contacted, before I did anything else, I contacted Middleway House, which is the resource center for survivors they're physically located in Monroe County, but they serve 5 other counties in the area. And I just asked, like, you know, I'm a survivor. This was my experience with the public library in my early days of my recovery from violence. It was really important to me. I want to make sure other survivors have access to the library. Like, is this something you're even seeing or hearing about? And they said yes. So what I did is Monroe County Public Library has a really cool internal grant called the Pioneer Grant, and it's anyone who works at the library in any department can write a proposal, turn it in, and I think you receive $1,500 to implement the proposal if it's accepted. So I decided to come up with it. I decided to apply to address this and use the funds to help address the issue. So, okay. There were multiple components. And again, if you have a chance or you're interested, on the handout that I provided, I have templates for new procedures based on what we created. So a large part of this, kind of the biggest hurdle for us was creating this new fines and fees forgiveness procedure for survivors who were forced to abandon their materials. And it required, at Monroe County Public Library, they have a leadership team. And so, there was like, we formed a committee and we came up with language, and it was presented to the leadership team. And then they were like, well, these things need to be changed. And then we would take it and bring it back. And eventually the leadership team voted on a version that they accepted. And so the language that we used, I borrowed for the template. So it's, it might not work for your organization, but it can give you sort of like something to look at. We issued an agency card. You might call it an institutional card, or I can't remember what my current library calls it, but it's a card that an organization will use rather than an individual. So we created this agency card for Middleway House, which is the crisis center. I thought this was going to be the easiest part of the grant, and it ended up being the last thing that we were able to complete. So I will talk about that more in a little bit. Middleway House brought a domestic violence 101 training. There is a link right here on the slide to a YouTube video of that training. So part of what we wanted with the training was to have it available for onboarding new staff members. And so this video exists so that like it can be part of the onboarding process. Now, I also like to have it because if for whatever reason you're not able to attend a training or not able to bring a training to your organization, you can watch this video, and I highly recommend it. There is also a link in that handout. We created these informational bookmarks. My original idea was to have like a flyer and someone else suggested, like, why don't we do a bookmark, kind of like the bookmark we have for people who were incarcerated, with the same kind of information about like what services we have available. And I was like, that's a great idea. That's way better. So we made the bookmarks. I'll show you a picture in a couple slides, or the next slide. The majority of the grant funds were used to purchase iPads and launch pads for the residents. And so they have an emergency shelter, and they also have transitional housing, which people are able to live in for up to 2 years while they're transitioning out of emergency or shelter housing and into permanent housing. So we kind of divided them up. The original idea for the tablets was for kids to be able to put headphones on while their caregiver was doing an intake, so that what the shelter wanted, or what the staff wanted, was a way for people who weren't able to get babysitting or someone else to watch the children, for them to be able to share without the kids hearing everything. They have ended up, it sort of evolved to being used in other ways, which is very cool. They also wanted them for residents who didn't feel safe going to the library. And so they are able to use the agency card, or the person can use their library card to access library services without having to go to the library. COVID-19 was a huge disruptor of all things. And it also increased the number of people reporting domestic violence. I think in Indiana, it was, I can't remember the percentage, it was 60-something% of calls coming into Indiana 211 went up from April to May of 2020. So we did a couple different things. The director of Middle Way House, her feeling was, someone who's like sheltering in place with their abuser might not be able to, or might not feel safe looking at the Middle Way House website, but they might look at the library's website, the library's social media. And so if we're sharing their information, then they might be able to learn that Middle Way House is still open, that they can still receive services from Middle Way House, even though the pandemic was in full swing. We also created, they created a book club, and we got them books. So we came up with a way to make temporary cards for survivors that kind of got around the issue of like having to come into the library. So the question I get the most is, how can library staff connect with crisis centers? And I want to start, I am sure there's somebody here right now who's like, I have tried and it's impossible. And my answer is it's really, really hard. And I recognize that. And it might not be possible in your community, or you don't have a crisis center in your community. So what I will say is that my experience has been that we are trying to work with a community partner that is helping people who are at risk of being murdered in that moment, in the time that they're interacting with them. And so they are literally in crisis 24/7 pretty much. So we're not, even if we have any kind of partnership, it's probably not going to be look the way we want it to, is probably not going to happen on our timeline. And like, we're not going to get fast response times from anyone we're interacting with because they're in constant crisis. I have a template letter or email that might help if you're trying to come up with like wording for reaching out. The other thing I would say is that it's really important for us to ask our potential partners what they need, if anything, or do they even need anything? I think that's what I would start with, is like, are you seeing this need? And if so, like, what do you need from us? Like, what can we do? And like, you know, it's got to be realistic and something we can provide. But I think if a library is coming in and saying, this is what we can do for you, that's not going to work. I know, like, for me, when I was at MCPL, I had a lot of pressure from leadership about like, well, let's just donate books to them and they can have their own library. And Middle Way House was like, no, we do not. We have books. People donate books all the time. We do not need your books. Please do not give us more books. And so like, I had to advocate, which was really stressful because I was a paraprofessional and, you know, I was talking to like administrators and, you know, librarians in leadership positions. So, but I think that's really, really important, is like to not make an assumption. And if you're really, really having trouble, I am happy to help you troubleshoot. Like, if you have any questions, I have my personal contact at the end of this. And I'm going to try to hurry up because I see it is 11 or 10:46 for you guys. Challenges. Middle Way House just didn't want the agency card. They were super stressed out about it. It took a really long time to get them on board. Some of our frontline staff were really confused about new procedures. We get a new procedure. At that institution, we were getting new procedures all the time. It was a large institution, I guess medium size, but we had 140 people working there. So like, I thought I could just like email people and be like, here are the new procedures. And that for some people it was fine. They were like, yeah, I get it. And other people, I ended up having to go like one-on-one talking to people who were on desk. We also had some issues with evaluating our outcomes because we had to figure out a way to like track things in the system that wasn't going to be like an privacy issue. This is just a picture of us delivering the tablets. That's my former coworker, who was a huge help to me. Definitely having people on your team is a huge help. And here's this informational bookmark. On one side, it has the resources that anyone can use, regardless of whether or not they have an account or an account in good standing. And on the other side, it has the specific things that you could use CAVS for. So on the left, that's just the library card. I am not going to go into too much because I talked too long, but this is just info. You can check out the slides later. COVID happened, and so my data got, you know, kind of cut off as far as what we were able to track. But, you know, 15 new library accounts in the program's first year. We actually had people coming in before the program started because they saw media about it. MCPL doesn't have overdue fines anymore, and they don't use a collections agency anymore. But even, you know, you can see replacement fees were the highest costs. And we didn't use grant funding to cover any of that. That was built into the library's regular procedures. So this is just observational data from Middle Way Crisis Center. Especially I think you can see that the fee forgiveness worked really well, and like people didn't have to feel ashamed of going to the library because of the fees anymore. What have I learned? Like the main thing I've learned is that this, now that I'm working in a different library in a completely different community, a lot of what we did at MCPL I know wouldn't work at Turner Free Library. And so I think intellectually I understood that, but I didn't really understand it until I was in a different community. I also have learned that this is a really hard issue. This is especially challenging in rural communities. And I have not come up with like a fantastic answer because I haven't had that experience. I do have some suggestions, and I am happy to like try to talk, with people about like, spitballing new ideas. This is my last slide. This is my personal information because I'm not representing any institution at this presentation. So feel free to reach out to me. If you call me, I probably won't answer, but text works. Email is definitely the best way, but I want to leave time for questions. And if you have more questions and they don't get answered, please feel free to reach out. So that is it from me.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. I put into the chat, those of you that are considering LSTA grant projects, there is a way to utilize those federal funds that come through the Mississippi Library Commission to your public libraries to support this kind of a project. Definitely talk to either Shelly or myself about how we can make that happen for you. Shelly and I are both really passionate about providing access to underserved populations in a variety of ways. And yeah, Shelly echoes yes. And I agree, Shannon. Some of, our rural communities, this is going to be hard because those of us that saw the map last week, there's one organization and sometimes it services 5 counties in our state. And so as we all know, everybody's resources are pretty tapped. So, small changes, looking at our policies, thinking about ways that we can make small modifications, I think can really make a strong impact. I'm sorry, Shannon, you were going to say something.
Oh, I did include some local resources on my handout as well. You might already have them, but I did notice at least a couple of them did say, even if you're not in one of the areas that we serve, you can contact us because we serve statewide. So it is really hard and devastating, I think also, because I have also heard that like the crisis center that really helped me, I know someone who went there recently and this was just their reporting to me what happened, but that they didn't have a good experience there. So like, and I think that's, as librarians, sometimes we can access information sort of like that's outside of the traditional channels. I know for me, in my current position, I have a patron who had become legally blind and was not able to access services going sort of the traditional route. And it took us like 6 months, and because I wasn't able, like, I'm not able to like do work for you, but I could provide her information with like other avenues to try. And she did eventually get hooked up with occupational therapy and things that she really needed but couldn't find on her own. So sometimes it's just, I think, getting creative or thinking outside the box can help. And I think just showing, even if we're just putting a display up during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is in October, that can help. that just shows that this is a place that's aware that there are survivors, that they exist, that they are welcome in the library. You know, looking at our collections and our circulating material, like what kind of books do we have? Do we have books for survivors? And again, not to plug my handout again, but in my handout, I have several books suggested to add to our collections. And I think it's also important to like have diverse representation. You know, are there books in our collection for people who are disabled survivors? Do we have books in our collections for people who are trans survivors? Like what material is available? And again, you know, budgets are the bottom line, so we have to work within that. But I do feel like even in the most difficult situation where maybe you don't have the support of leadership, or your organization doesn't feel like this is an issue, there's still small things that we can do, and that's a start.
100%, Shannon. And, you know, a lot of us that are in rural communities, while we may not have official shelters and things like that, we do know people in our communities, whether they come from faith-based organizations or just somebody, a shelter or a food pantry. Just there are other ways that there are people that we can partner with and connect with to help spread the word about, you know, maybe if you are building a new collection or you are changing a policy, to just kind of covertly get that word out about how the library is being more inclusive to those that are domestic violence survivors. So yeah.
Yeah, and if budget and availability are an issue, like particularly, you know, with building those collections, and especially with, you know, the more underrepresented, you know, subcategories of domestic violence survivors, like talk to us here at MLC, because if nothing else, I can round up all kinds of digital resources for you, and I can make graphics or brochures and stuff that you can, if nothing else, print out and have available for people to take with them.
Small changes, big impacts, the butterfly effect sort of thing, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, any last comments or questions for Shannon before we kind of end today's session? Okay, I appreciate you all taking the time in this bananas weather that we got going on in our state to come to this training. If you feel like this session would be beneficial for other staff at your library, we will have a recording available on our YouTube channel. And Kayla's going to send out all of the resources for all of the things that we have for Shannon. So I appreciate you, Shannon, being so forthright with your materials. And I really hope that we see some modifications of this program make its way across our state as well. So thank you, Shannon, for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I know it is hard. You know, taking time to do anything is hard these days, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everybody. Stay safe out there.